The hillside stood undisturbed for longer than anyone alive in 1906 could have said with any certainty. It rose above the eastern edge of the Sonoma Valley, a shoulder of dark volcanic rock and thin topsoil planted in vine rows only a few years before, replacing wild oat and blue oak. On the 18th of April, at 12 minutes past 5 in the morning, the ground beneath Northern California released nearly 300 miles of stored strain along the San Andreas Fault in well under a minute. San Francisco absorbed most of what followed in public memory: the fires, the collapsed hotels, the toppled dome of City Hall, and there is good reason for that. But 40 miles to the north, Santa Rosa lost more of its people per capita than any other place struck that morning, and the same violent motion tore across the hills above the Sonoma Valley with enough force to split open ground that had not moved within any settler's memory. On a vineyard east of the town of Sonoma, a hired hand named Warren Tolliver walked out at first light to check on a pair of plough horses and found that the slope above the lower vine terraces had sheared clean away overnight, leaving a raw gash of broken rock where solid hillside had stood the evening before. What he found inside that opening was not simply a landslide scar. It was a curve of fitted stone, dressed and set without a trace of mortar, holding its shape while the loose ground around it had failed completely. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Tolliver did not touch it that morning. He walked back down to the ranch house and brought the vineyard's owner, a French immigrant named Theo Renaud, who had planted the property 9 years earlier after arriving from the Rhone Valley with cuttings wrapped in wet burlap and almost no English. Renaud had spent those 9 years learning the hillside's moods, where the frost pooled, where the basalt broke the plough, where the soil ran thin over volcanic bedrock. He had never seen anything like what the earthquake had opened. Set into the raw scar, roughly 11 feet below what had been the original slope face, was the crown of an arch built from cut and fitted stone blocks, each one shaped to meet its neighbor along a curved joint, with no visible gap and no trace of any binding material. The stone itself was local. Later description placed it as basalt from the same volcanic flows that ran through the rest of the hillside, the kind of hard, dense rock that any Sonoma Valley rancher of the period would have recognized on sight, because it was the same stone breaking their plow blades every spring. What separated this from an ordinary outcrop was the shaping. The blocks were not simply broken and stacked. They had been cut to a curve, dressed on their exposed faces, and fitted together with a precision that neither man had words for at the time, and that neither man could explain by anything either of them had seen built in the valley before, including the old mission itself. Renaud spent the better part of that first day on his knees in the mud with a lantern, working loose soil away from the exposed joints with his bare hands rather than a shovel, worried that a careless strike would crack a stone that had already survived one earthquake. He noted later that the underside of the arch, where it curved back into the hillside, was missing the chisel scars and wedge holes he associated with ordinary quarrying, none of the marks that showed up on the old mission foundations or on the newer retaining walls his own hired crews had built. The surface, where it had not been scoured by the landslide, looked worn rather than cut, as though whatever tools had shaped it belonged to a tradition neither he nor Tolliver recognized. Tolliver, for his part, later told a neighbor that the joints reminded him of dry stacked field walls he had seen as a boy in the eastern states, except finer, tighter, and curved in a way no field wall he had ever built or repaired had needed to be. Neither man was equipped to judge age from stonework alone, and Renaud's ledger is careful, even in its broken English, not to claim more than what he could see. What he could see was enough to send him into town within the day. That last comparison mattered, because the Sonoma Valley had exactly one mission, and everyone in the valley knew its construction inside and out. Mission San Francisco Solano de Sonoma had been founded on the 4th of July, 1823, by the Franciscan priest Jose Altamira, and it held the distinction of being the 21st and final mission built in Alta California, the only one founded after Mexican independence had already ended Spanish rule. Altamira's founding was itself controversial within the mission system. He had pushed to consolidate the older missions at San Rafael and San Francisco into a single new establishment further north, a plan the mission president in Mexico City had never formally approved, and the dispute that followed was settled only after the fact, once the new mission was already standing. Its walls were adobe brick reinforced with rubble footing, plastered and whitewashed, built largely by native laborers drawn from San Rafael and San Francisco under Franciscan direction, using a method every child in the valley had seen repaired and patched 100 times by the 1890s. Adobe does not hold a fitted curve of dressed volcanic stone. It does not need to, because adobe construction was never meant to bear weight the way a true masonry arch does, and the true arch itself, a self-supporting curve of wedge-shaped stones locking against one another under compression, does not appear anywhere in the documented architectural traditions of pre-contact California. Whatever Tolliver and Renaud were looking at that April morning had been built using a technique the mission never used, in a material the mission crews rarely touched beyond foundation stones, in a location more than 3 miles from the mission walls and well outside any recorded outbuilding, corral, or boundary marker associated with the mission's known footprint. The obvious explanation, that this was simply an unrecorded piece of mission-era construction, ran directly into the fact that it did not resemble mission-era construction in any respect except its age relative to American settlement. It looked older, or at least it looked like it belonged to a different building tradition entirely, one that Valley residents in 1906 had no ready name for. To understand why that gap mattered so much to the people who eventually heard about it, it helps to understand what the Sonoma Valley actually was before the mission ever stood there. The valley had been home for thousands of years to the Wapo, whose language forms an isolate unrelated to the tongues spoken by their immediate neighbors, and to bands of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo, whose territories bordered the valley to the south and west. To the east, across low hills, lay the country of the Suisun Patwin, whose leader in the 1830s, a man baptized under the name Solano, would later lend that name to the county bordering Sonoma's own. These were not simple foraging bands scraping by on what the land happened to offer. The archaeological and ethnographic record built up over the following century, particularly the survey work conducted by Samuel Barrett and published through the University of California in 1908, documented an intricate geography of named village sites, seasonal camps, fishing stations along Sonoma Creek, and acorn processing grounds that had been in continuous use for generations before any Europeans set foot in the valley. Barrett's survey alone recorded dozens of named locations across Sonoma and Napa counties, each tied to specific families, specific resources, and specific seasonal rounds, the kind of detailed working geography that only comes from a population deeply and permanently rooted in a landscape rather than passing lightly through it. Just to the east of where Tolliver found the arch, in what is now Annadel, lay one of the richest obsidian sources in Northern California, a volcanic glass quarry that native toolmakers worked for thousands of years and traded outward across an area stretching from the Napa Valley to the Pacific coast. Obsidian hydration studies conducted on material from that quarry decades later would place its earliest documented use well back into the pre-contact record, long before any Spanish presence in California. People who could organize obsidian extraction, working, and long-distance trade on that scale possessed exactly the kind of coordinated labor and specialized knowledge that any large stone construction project would require. What the ethnographic record from Barrett's survey and the later work built on it does not describe, anywhere in its pages, is fitted stone architecture, tule houses, plank canoes, woven baskets tight enough to hold water, extensive trade networks, yes. Load-bearing masonry, no. That absence is not proof of anything by itself, and it should not be read as a verdict on what Wapo or Pomo builders were capable of, since plenty of building traditions choose not to build in stone, even when the material and the labor are both available. But it does mean the arch cannot simply be filed under any known regional building tradition, indigenous or mission era, and that leaves the 11 feet of hillside above it, and the thousands of years of documented use beneath it, harder to account for than either easy explanation would suggest on its own. The world Renaud and Tolliver were standing in that April morning had already been reshaped at least twice by the time the earthquake opened the hillside. The first reshaping came with the mission and the Presidio system built to support it, which pulled native labor from a wide radius, including from villages the mission itself had never formally founded, into a controlled agricultural and construction economy that lasted just over a decade before secularization ended it in 1834. The second reshaping came almost immediately after, when General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo arrived from the Presidio of San Francisco to formally close the mission and convert Sonoma into a military and administrative center for Mexican California's northern frontier. Vallejo built the Sonoma barracks from adobe salvaged in part from mission structures, distributed former mission land into private rancho grants running well up into the hills east of the plaza, and forged an alliance with Chief Solano of the Suisun Patwin that allowed Mexican authority to extend north and east with Patwin military support, rather than against continued native resistance. That alliance reshaped the valley's political map as much as any building project, drawing Patwin, Wapo, and Coast Miwok communities into a shifting network of cooperation, conscription, and occasional open conflict that left its own scattered traces across the hills long before any vineyard was ever planted there. By the time American settlers raised the bear flag over the Sonoma Plaza in June of 1846, the valley had already passed through mission control, Mexican Rancho Division, and an uneasy native Mexican alliance, each layer leaving its own physical trace on the ground: adobe walls, boundary markers, corral posts, without any of those layers accounting for a fitted stone arch buried under 11 feet of hillside 3 miles east of town. That gap between the documented layers of Sonoma Valley history and what the 1906 earthquake exposed is the center of what makes this account worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing outright. It does not require inventing a lost civilization or a vanished race to notice that a specific, physical, dressed stone structure sat under a specific hillside, built from local material, using a technique absent from every documented building tradition known to have occupied that ground. It requires only taking the physical description seriously enough to ask who built it and when, and admitting that the honest answer, in 1906 and today both, is that nobody has ever been able to say. What Renaud and Tolliver actually recorded about the structure comes down to a single surviving account, and it deserves to be treated with the same caution any single unverified witness deserves. Renaud kept a small ledger for vineyard business, expenses, weather, frost dates, the ordinary bookkeeping of a working farm, and 3 pages of that ledger, dated the 19th through the 22nd of April 1906, describe the discovery in his own halting English. According to that account, the exposed section of arch measured roughly 6 feet across at its widest point and rose perhaps 4 feet from where the collapsed slope had buried its base. The stones, Renaud wrote, were fitted so closely that he could not work a knife blade into the seams, and the surface of each block had been smoothed rather than left rough from breaking. He measured what he could reach, sketched a rough profile in the ledger margin, and noted that the arch appeared to continue further into the hillside than the earthquake's damage had exposed, meaning that what Tolliver found that April morning was very likely only a fragment of something considerably larger still buried in the slope. Renaud did the responsible thing by the standards of the period. He rode into the town of Sonoma and reported the find to the local justice of the peace, who in turn forwarded a brief written notice north towards Santa Rosa, where the state's newly formed earthquake investigation effort had established a temporary field office in the weeks after the disaster. That effort, the State Earthquake Investigation Commission, had been convened by Governor George Pardee within days of the earthquake and placed under the direction of Andrew Lawson, a geology professor at the University of California. Lawson's commission would eventually produce one of the most thorough scientific studies of a single earthquake ever assembled up to that point, cataloging fault traces, ground deformation, and structural damage across the entire ruptured zone from Humboldt County to San Juan Bautista. It is a genuinely remarkable document, and it remains a primary source for seismologists studying the 1906 event more than a century later. But the Commission's field capacity in the spring of 1906 was stretched across a disaster zone larger than most states, and its priorities, reasonably enough, ran toward documenting the fault trace itself, the collapsed buildings, the human toll in Santa Rosa and San Francisco, and the mechanics of ground rupture, rather than chasing secondary reports of unusual stonework on a private vineyard 3 miles outside a small town that had, by comparison to Santa Rosa, come through the disaster relatively lightly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. A single commission field assistant, a young man whose surname survives in the correspondence only as Ren, did eventually make the trip out to the Renaud property, roughly 3 weeks after the initial report reached Santa Rosa. By the time he arrived, Renaud's canvas covering had already sagged under 2 weeks of spring rain, and Ren's letter notes, almost in passing, that he had to clear standing water out of the excavation before he could photograph the exposed joints properly. Ren's visit is documented in exactly one surviving piece of correspondence, a letter from Ren to a colleague still working within the Commission's Santa Rosa office, mentioning that he had examined a partially exposed masonry feature on the Renaud vineyard, taken several photographic plates, and removed a small fragment of the dressed stone for closer examination back in Berkeley. He described the fitting of the stones as unusually fine, finer than anything he had seen in the rubble foundations of the mission itself, and noted that Renaud had asked him directly whether the university intended to send anyone qualified to properly excavate the site. The letter promises a fuller report to follow once the immediate earthquake documentation work eased. No fuller report exists in the Commission's surviving files. Lawson's eventual 2-volume publication, released in 1908 through the Carnegie Institution, focuses almost entirely on the fault trace, structural failures, and seismic mechanics of the disaster, and makes no mention of the Sonoma find at all. Whether Ren's report was written and lost, filed somewhere outside the Commission's main archive, or simply never completed as the Commission's attention moved permanently toward its primary scientific mandate, the surviving record does not say. What the record does show is that Ren's photographic plates and the stone fragment he removed were logged, briefly, in an intake ledger belonging to the University of California's Anthropology Museum in Berkeley, the institution built up under Phoebe Hearst's early funding and Alfred Kroeber's direction beginning in 1901. The ledger entry lists the fragment by a temporary catalogue number, describes it only as worked stone, Sonoma vicinity, and includes no further accession information. No object matching that description appears in the museum's later, more thorough 20th century catalogue reorganizations, which is not itself unusual. The museum's earliest years produced thousands of similarly thin entries, specimens logged quickly by overextended staff and never properly cross-referenced before later curators imposed more rigorous standards. The fragment, along with whatever photographic plates Ren produced, appears to have simply stopped being tracked sometime between the ledger entry and the museum's next full inventory, an outcome that was not unusual for minor accessions handled by overworked staff during a period when the university itself was absorbing earthquake damage and diverting resources toward more urgent priorities. This is the pattern that runs through nearly every account like it. What happened here was an ordinary, almost mundane kind of institutional neglect, the sort that happens whenever a genuinely significant find arrives at the wrong moment, competing for attention against a disaster that has already claimed every available hour of every available expert, with no deliberate order from above required to produce it. Lawson's commission had real work to do, and did it well. The Berkeley Museum had a real collection to build, and built an important one. Neither institution acted in bad faith. Both were staffed by capable people operating under enormous strain, choosing, reasonably, to finish the work directly in front of them rather than chase a secondary report from a small town that had, relative to Santa Rosa, come through the disaster lightly. But neither institution had room in the spring and summer of 1906 to follow that secondary report to any real conclusion, and the gap left by that lack of room is exactly where this account has sat, unresolved, for well over a century. A find like this slips through that kind of gap easily, and without any malice or deliberate cover-up. It only takes a disaster large enough and a set of institutions stretched thin enough for a single field visit and a single unlabeled fragment to become the entire surviving record of something that might otherwise have reshaped how the valley's history gets told. Renaud's own account ends without much drama. His ledger notes that he covered the exposed section of arch with canvas and boards through the remainder of that spring, intending to protect it until someone from the university could return and complete a proper examination. Nobody did. Renaud wrote to the university office in Berkeley twice more that summer, once in June and once in late August, asking, in his careful and formal English, whether a team would be sent before the rains returned. Neither letter received a substantive reply beyond a brief acknowledgement that the matter had been noted. By the following planting season, with vine rows to reset and a slope that needed stabilizing before the winter rains could widen the earthquake scar into a full landslide, Renaud made the practical decision that most working farmers in his position would have made. He had the exposed section backfilled, regraded the slope, and replanted the terrace, choosing the certainty of a working vineyard over the uncertainty of a structure nobody with the authority or expertise to properly document had returned to examine. His final ledger entry on the subject, dated the following October, simply notes that the hillside had been made safe again. He never mentions the arch in his surviving papers after that date, though family accounts passed down informally rather than written into any ledger describe him pointing out the general location to his own children decades later, telling them only that something old had once been under that particular stretch of vine row. What survives of the account today comes almost entirely through Renaud family memory rather than any institutional record. The ledger itself passed down through 3 generations before a descendant donated it to a regional historical collection in the 1970s. Where it now sits largely unexamined among hundreds of similar ordinary farm records from the period, most of them concerned with frost dates, grape yields, and the ordinary business of running a small vineyard through the early 20th century. No archaeologist has ever excavated the site with modern methods. No ground-penetrating radar survey has ever been conducted on that particular hillside, which today sits beneath several more decades of vine rows and a property line that has changed hands at least 4 times since Theo Renaud first planted it. The exact location described in the ledger, roughly 11 feet below the original slope face, on a terrace east of the old wagon road, can be narrowed to within perhaps a quarter mile using period property maps, but no closer than that without new fieldwork that nobody has yet undertaken. What makes the Renaud account difficult to dismiss outright is not any single piece of evidence, because taken alone, an immigrant vineyard owner's earthquake-era farm ledger proves very little. It is the way the account sits precisely inside a real and well-documented gap. The earthquake itself is not in question. Its scale, its timing, its effect on Sonoma County are among the best documented natural disasters in American history. The absence of fitted stone architecture from the region's known Wapo, Coast Miwok, and Pomo building traditions is not in question either, and neither is the well-documented Adobe construction method used at Mission San Francisco Solano. The State Earthquake Investigation Commission's overwhelming focus on the primary disaster zone is not in question, nor is the well-documented strain placed on the University of California's resources, including its Young Anthropology Museum, in the months following the quake. Each of those facts stands on its own, verified and unremarkable. What remains genuinely unresolved is the narrow space between them, the specific claim that a fitted, mortarless stone arch built from local basalt using a technique absent from every known regional building tradition, sat under a Sonoma Valley hillside for long enough that nobody in 1906 could account for it, and that the one documented attempt to examine it properly dissolved into a lost report, an unlabeled fragment, and a backfilled hillside before anyone with the training to answer the question ever returned. Every institution involved did exactly what its mandate required of it, and the arch simply fell into the narrow space none of those mandates covered. A skeptic has every right to point out that a single ledger, a single letter, and a single missing museum entry do not constitute proof of anything unusual, and that skepticism deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissal. The honest answer is that the surviving record simply stops where a proper excavation would need to begin, and no amount of reasoning from the documents alone can finish the work that only fieldwork was ever going to complete. Andrew Lawson went on to a long and genuinely distinguished career after his commission's report was published, eventually giving his name to the fault system that had caused the disaster his commission studied, and eventually chairing Berkeley's geology department for decades afterward. Berkeley's Anthropology Museum grew, over the following decades, into one of the most significant collections of California native material culture anywhere in the country. Much of it gathered by researchers working in exactly the tradition Barrett had established with his 1908 survey of Pomo village geography, and later expanded through decades of fieldwork across the state under Kroeber's long tenure. Neither institution's later success closes the gap left by what happened, or did not happen, on the Renaud Vineyard in the spring of 1906. If anything, the strength of both institutions afterward makes the gap harder to explain away as simple incompetence. These were capable people working within capable, well-funded organizations, institutions that went on to train generations of the geologists and anthropologists who eventually defined how California's deep past gets studied, and the report still went unfinished, the fragments still went unlabeled, and the site still went back under the hillside, without anyone returning to settle the question one way or another. The competence of what came after only sharpens the question of what was missed at the time. The Sonoma Valley today looks very little like it did in 1906. Vineyards have replaced most of the wild oat hillsides that Renaud and his neighbors first planted over, and the town of Sonoma itself has grown from a small agricultural center into one of Northern California's more recognizable wine country destinations, its plaza and mission walls preserved for generations now as part of the California State Park system. Tourists walk the mission grounds every week, examining adobe walls that have been documented, measured, restored, and explained in exhaustive detail, reading placards that account for nearly every stone and beam Franciscan crews ever set in place. A few miles east, under a hillside that has changed ownership repeatedly and been replanted at least twice since Theo Renaud's day, the structure his ledger describes has never been re-examined by anyone with the training or the equipment to say definitively what it is, how old it is, or who built it. It may simply be an unusual, unrecorded piece of 19th century ranch construction that Renaud, in the disorientation following a major earthquake, mistook for something older and stranger than it actually was. It may be something considerably harder to explain within the region's known building traditions, something that predates the mission, predates the Rancho period, and predates every documented layer of construction the valley has ever produced. Without a proper excavation, and without the fragment Wren removed ever resurfacing in any museum's later inventory, there is no way to settle the question from the surviving record alone. What the surviving record does establish, without much room for dispute, is that a documented earthquake exposed a documented structure on a documented vineyard, that a documented state commission sent a documented field assistant to examine it, and that the trail of that examination runs directly into an undocumented gap between a single letter promising a fuller report and a single unlabeled ledger entry in a university museum's earliest, least organized years. That gap has sat quietly for well over a century, outlasting the men who first opened it, outlasting the vines planted and replanted above it, and outlasting every institution that briefly touched it and then moved on to more pressing work. Whatever finally answers the question of what General Vallejo's soldiers, the mission's Franciscan builders, and the Wapo and Coast Miwok families who had worked that land for thousands of years before any of them arrived, would have made of a fitted stone arch under their own hillside, that answer is still sitting, quite literally, under several more decades of vine rows east of the Sonoma Plaza, waiting for someone to look again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.